So today we come to the last in our sermon series on the book of Nehemiah, an Old Testament book that we've been exploring since September. And there are 13 chapters in Nehemiah, and today we're going to have a look at 13. But let's have a quick recap of where we've got to. So God's people were in exile. They'd rebelled against God, and despite his many warnings, they hadn't listened and turned back to him. So he'd let them be defeated by foreign kings. The Babylonians had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and carried pretty much all the people off into slavery. But as time went on, Babylon was defeated by Assyria, and the king of Assyria allowed some of the people to return to Jerusalem. The first lot went back and they kind of rebuilt the temple, but the city was still in ruins and the walls were in ruins, which meant it was unsafe and undefended. And so we get to the book of Nehemiah. There we go. Okay, so in chapter 1, Nehemiah hears about the state of Jerusalem and he prays to God. In chapter 2, Nehemiah speaks to the king and is granted permission to make repairs to the city. He heads to Jerusalem and weighs up the job. In chapter 3, we hear about the organisation of the work, how every single person got involved in rebuilding the walls, not just the builders, but the perfume makers, the priests, the blacksmiths, everybody played their part. In chapter 4, we heard about how they faced opposition, but the workers were armed and they kept going. In chapter 5, Nehemiah stopped the opposition of the poor in the city. In chapter 6, they faced more opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah and Geshem. That name's going to be important later. But the walls were still completed in 52 days. In chapter 7, they set up gatekeepers and some more of the exiles started to return. There was lots of lists in that chapter. In chapter 8, Ezra read the law, the Levites explained it, and then the people got into the practice of doing it. They celebrated the Festival of Booths. In chapter 9, there's a review of Israel's story. The people confess their sins and vow to be faithful to God again. In chapter 10, the leaders sign a covenant and the people promise to live by God's laws. And in chapter 12, Jerusalem is repopulated again, lots of lists of all the names of the people, lists of leaders and servants in Jerusalem. The inauguration of the wall and duties in the temple are outlined. And then actually, somewhere between chapters 12 and 13, the first few verses of 13 are from before, but Nehemiah leaves. He's been in Jerusalem for about 12 years, and at some point, for some reason, he goes back to the king. Maybe he needed to give a report, or show that he hadn't run away, or show that he was still loyal to the king. So he goes back to the king of Assyria, and then later on he returns to Jerusalem, and chapter 13 is about that return. The very few verses are before we left, but then the rest of it is after he returns. So we're going to read chapter 13 together now. Okay, Nehemiah 13. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. Before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, singers and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later I asked for his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God and the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the services had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine and oil into the storerooms. I put Shalomah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and the Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan the son of Zaccur and the son of Mattaniah their assistant, because these men were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their brothers. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. In those days I saw men in Judah treading winepresses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, "What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same thing, so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." When evening shadows fell on the gate of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gate so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourself." Was it not because of marriages like this that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there was no king like him. He was loved by God, and God made him king over all Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all the terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duty, each to his own task. I also made provisions for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruit. Remember me with favour, O my God. So, we've kind of read about the success of building the walls and making the covenants and the confessing and making the vows. And yet here, things have not gone so well in Nehemiah's absence. The people have promised to follow the way of God, and yet there are 4 key areas in which they have compromised. They've compromised in areas of power, in areas of finances, in areas of using their time, and in their relationships. So let's explore that a little bit further. So first of all, in issues to do with power. The first thing Nehemiah tells us about in his return is the issue to do with Tobiah, who'd been given a room in the house of God. Well, who is this Tobiah? This is not the first time that he has popped up in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 2, when Nehemiah first calls the people of God to help rebuild the wall, we read this. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and ridiculed us, saying, "What is this you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We are his servants who will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." So Tobiah, right from the start, has been opposed to God's people and to what God has called them to do. And in Nehemiah 6, you can read more about that. They cause more issues, and they threaten to kidnap Nehemiah and try and stop the progress. Although at the end of Nehemiah, when the walls are finished, Tobiah kind of changes his tactics. So once the walls are done, there's no point opposing it anymore, right? Instead, he gets people to big him up and write letters about how great he is to Nehemiah and tries to intimidate Nehemiah to giving him power. It seems to all be about power with Tobiah. He's some kind of official, and it would seem that he's trying to gain power in any way that he can. But he's opposed what God is doing. He's opposed the way of God. And right at the start, Nehemiah is saying, listen, you've got no place. There's nothing in here for you. You've opposed this work. This isn't for you. And yet, just a few chapters later, we're reading that he's been given a room in the house of God. This is an enemy who's managed to wheedle his way in and try and gain power for himself. And we don't know how he's done that. Maybe he's given a bribe. Maybe he's related to the priest that's mentioned there. We don't exactly know what's happened. It does say that several other people had sort of owed him things and were in his debt and that kind of thing. So perhaps he's sort of managed to wheedle his way in that way. But this is a holy place, the house of God, a place that should have been used for worship, and it's been compromised by evil men seeking their own power and seeking to build their own kingdom, not God's glory. Sadly, how often do we see today compromise in God's church because people are seeking their own power and not God's glory? When people seek to build their own kingdom, their own ministry, their own name, their own fame, and they're not seeking God's kingdom. What's interesting here is that there's a reason that Tobiah was able to take the rooms in the first place is linked to another area of compromise, and that's to do with finances, the tithes and offerings. The room Tobiah had been given was a room in the storehouse, which should have been used to hold the tithes and offerings given by God's people. And these weren't always financial. Sometimes it was grain or produce or different things that could be used. And some of those things were used in the temple, like incense was used in the worship. But also some of those tithes and offerings were used to feed the people who served in the temple, some of the Levites. The Levites weren't paid in the traditional way that we might think of it now, but instead they were able to take from those offerings to feed themselves and their family. So as Nehemiah discovers, those offerings haven't been made, and so the Levites didn't have any food. So they didn't really have any choice but to go back to the field and to grow their own grain and become farmers again so they could feed themselves and their families. They'd had to leave the temple and leave their duties because the people weren't giving in the way that God had commanded them. And Nehemiah is pretty cross about this. And actually, we can read in Malachi that God appears to be pretty cross about this too. Malachi was a prophet, and although we don't know the exact timing, he was a contemporary of Nehemiah. So there's very good reason to believe that he was speaking into the same situation here and the same way that people were holding back. And this is what it says in Malachi 3. I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. Ever since the time of your ancestors, you have turned away from my decrees and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord Almighty. But you ask, how are we to return? Will a mere mortal rob God, yet you rob me? But you ask, how are we robbing you? In tithes and offerings. You are under a curse, your whole nation, because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will be not room enough to store it. Now, it can be really tricky to talk about money, can't it? It's tricky because I think in our society we all get a bit awkward and it's not really the thing to do. We don't really talk about money. It's not seen as polite conversation. It can be extra tricky at the moment because, well, money is a topic that we're talking about, isn't it? Because money's tight and all of us are feeling the pinch as bills go up and costs go up and, there's lots of people feeling a lot of anxiety about money. And in some ways it's even trickier for me to talk about money being given to the church because a bit like the Levites in the story, I am paid, provided for, by the money that is given to this church. But actually, I think it's worth us just spending a couple of minutes exploring this a bit further. And actually, let me clarify a few things on how money and tithes and offering work here, because for some of you who are newer, you may not be aware. So as a Baptist church, we're an independent church, we're an independent charity when it comes to our finances. So there's no central funding for the work of the church. All the money we have in the bank, all the money we have to spend comes through tithes and offerings given to us by members of the church. And if you're not familiar with that word tithe, a tithe means a percentage of annual produce or earnings. So back in the day, the farmers brought a percentage of their grain or a percentage of their chickens or whatever to the offering. Now, most of us are paid in money, so we will bring a percentage of our money to the church. And usually, a tithe is seen around 10%. And this comes from the biblical view of tithe and offerings, which Nehemiah is referring to here. There's an awful lot written about this in the Old Testament, in particular in Leviticus. If you want to get into it a little bit more, I can point you in the right direction. So as a church, we use the tithes and offerings that are given to us for the work of the church. And some people give us through cash. We've got donation boxes. Some people give us through online giving, got direct debit set up. I do that because otherwise I just forget. It's easier if it just goes out the bank and I don't have to remember to bring my cash. But there's different ways that people give, and we're incredibly grateful for all the ways that people give. And then that money comes into the church, and then it's used for Lots of different things. It's used for my wage. It's used for the wage of Alan, our cleaner. It's also used for the heating and the lighting. It's used for roof repairs and tea bags and chairs and tables, the licenses that we need to play songs or stream things on Zoom, resources for our kids' work, wire for the computer, so much more. It's used for all the different things. And we also tithe what we receive as well. So we receive money and then we give away a percentage of that to other charities and organisations. And as I've said, we are so grateful for all that you give. We're grateful for everyone who has given to the church. And so in talking about money, I don't want to put on any guilt or shame or try and manipulate people. It's a challenge, isn't it? Because all of us are facing a challenge financially, and many of us who would have had more money perhaps don't have as much money and things are tight, and I completely understand that. Just to be clear, it's always free to come to church. You do not have to pay, and there's never a pressure. But equally, we as a church face a challenge as well, because just as everyone's bills have gone up, our bills have gone up. Our heating costs, for example, have gone up 6-fold what they used to be. And our giving has gone down over the last 5 years. Our giving's gone down by about 20% over the last few years. So we are facing a challenge financially. I'm not at the point of the Levites. I'm not about to go off and buy a field and try and farm. I'd be rubbish at that anyway. So we're not at that point of desperate measures, but I do want to make you aware that that's where we're up to. And we're going to talk about a bit more about this actually at the members' meeting. We want to be really transparent about how we spend our money. You can go on the Charity Commission website and find our church, and you can download all the accounts and see what we spend our money on. We really want to be clear on that. We don't want there to be anything hidden. But I just wanted to be clear about how the money works at church. And that may be something then that you want to think about a bit more. Is there a way that you could give to church? If you want to, there are boxes. There's one at the back and there's one by the door there. And if you're interested in giving online, there are some forms on the notice board at the back and on the form that give you the details about giving online. And another way that you can help us, if you pay tax, is you can take one of these gift aid forms and fill it in. And that means that we can claim back 25%. I'm saying 25%, or is it 20%? This is why I'm not the treasurer. It's either 20% or 25%. We do it properly, whatever it is. We can claim back money that you've paid on tax for the work of the church, and it doesn't cost you a penny. So if you've got any more questions about our finances, you can talk to John, who actually isn't here today, but he is normally with us on a Sunday. And like I say, all of our information, financial information, is available online, and we really want to be transparent about what we spend our money on. But more broadly, I think there's a challenge in this passage for us about how we use our finances generally. Jesus spoke about money a lot, that wasn't because he was trying to get it for himself. Jesus didn't have a big fancy house. He didn't have an aeroplane that you see some of these televangelists have and all that kind of stuff. He lived a really humble life. So him talking about money wasn't because he wanted it for himself. It wasn't about him being greedy. But it's because he knows that our desire for money and our need for possessions can control us. And in Matthew 6, he said this: "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then light is within you, If then the light within you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So it's a challenge, isn't it, for us to think about how we spend our money, how we value our money, how we value our possessions. And it's so easy to compromise in those ways and start to give those things priority when actually God has called us to be open-handed and generous with what we have. And so we see that finances was a way that the people of God had started to compromise in Nehemiah 13. And they'd also started to compromise as well in the use of their time. So in verse 15, Nehemiah talks about how he sees the people of God working on the Sabbath. And way back, when God gave the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, he said this: "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy." And again, the practice of Sabbath is something that comes up in the Bible a lot. And in the busyness of our lives now, perhaps it's something we need even more to focus on. I recently read The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. Ironically, I started reading that book last year and I was too busy to finish it with my dissertation, but then the dissertation was done and I had a bit more time. But he talks a lot about Sabbath and what Sabbath means and the importance of breaking the curse of busyness. And he refers to someone called Walter Brueggemann, who is a scholar that I love, and he says this: in our own contemporary context of the rat race of anxiety, the celebration of Sabbath is both an act of resistance and alternative. It is resistance because it is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumptions of commodity goods. I think in our society, busyness is quite often a badge of honour, isn't it? If someone says to you, how are you? You go, oh, I'm really busy. Oh, they must be important, or they must be valuable, or what they're doing must be really important. But actually, Sabbath, that rest, is a way of saying, I am not God. I can stop, and the world will keep turning. It does not all revolve around me. It's a time to rest, a time to reset, a time to focus on God and be reminded of who He is and who He's made us to be. It's a time to be reminded that our value is not in what we can make or produce or do or earn or how many emails we can reply, but it's about in being known and loved by God. And it's so important that we get this rest, that it's in the 10 Commandments. In fact, that one about Sabbath is the biggest one in the 10 Commandments. And yet here in Nehemiah 13, there are people breaking the Sabbath. They're not prioritising that time with God. They're prioritising buying and selling stuff and taking the focus off God and His rest and putting it back onto material things. Now, society is different, isn't it? Sunday isn't perhaps the day of rest that it used to be. For me, Sunday is definitely not a day of rest. It's a work day for me. It's a very busy one. I get my steps up on a Sunday. So for me, I find Sabbath at a different time of the week. Part of my swimming that I do, I've talked about that before, is part of my Sabbath, being out in nature, reflecting, taking that moment to pause. And there's different ways that we can find that rest. And it's not necessarily the challenge about finding a whole day, although I do think that's a really good practice. But there's more generally a challenge here about how we spend our time. Do we prioritise time with God and time with God's people? Or is it an optional extra? Is it, oh, well, I'll go to church if I can fit it in, or I'll be part of that if I can fit it in. I'll spend time praying if I've got some spare time. Or is it the thing that we put first in our diary and fit in everything else? And believe me, guys, I need to hear this challenge because I'm someone who is always very, very busy. There's lots going on at church. There's lots to do. There's lots of emails, especially when you've been on holiday and you get back and there's loads of emails and loads of stuff going on. But I know that if I'm not resting and spending that time with God, then I'm giving out on empty and it's a waste of my time anyway. And then the final area of compromise that we see in this chapter is to do with relationships. So it's talking about how the people of Judah have married people from Ashdod, Ammon and Moab. And again, these places have come up before in Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 4, people from these places opposed the building of the walls and decided to attack the city. So these are people who've been opposed to God's ways. And I want to be really clear here, this whole thing in this passage is not about God being anti-foreigner. It's not about racial purity. It's about purity of heart. It's about not being distracted. And that's why Nehemiah refers to King Solomon. King Solomon was this great king. His dad, King David, was like the best king ever. King Solomon was super wise. He had all this money. He asked God for wisdom. He built the temple. Amazing. And yet he married lots of foreign women who brought with them foreign gods. And soon enough, Solomon and the other people of Judah are worshipping all these different gods and getting into some really sketchy stuff. But there are also examples of God drawing in people from other nations. So we just said King Solomon married foreign women and got completely distracted and ended up worshipping foreign gods. And yet, King Solomon's great-great-grandmother was Ruth, a Moabite. There's a whole book in the Bible about Ruth. She is in the line of Jesus. So it's not about someone... Ruth came and wanted to serve God and learn about God, and she became part of the people of God. So it's not about saying people from other races can't come in. It's about understanding who are we worshipping, and are we sticking to that, or are we going to get distracted by other things? Later on, we see that Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman and told the story of the Good Samaritan, and he broke down barriers, didn't he, about race and culture. He healed the centurion and the centurion's daughter, and he broke down those barriers about class and religion and race and all those things. He wanted all people to be welcome to know him and know that he was the true way. And later on as well, we see Paul, who was one of the early leaders of the church, says this: "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, yet all are one in Christ Jesus." So he's saying here that it doesn't matter what race you are, all of us are welcome to follow Jesus. And yet also Paul does say elsewhere in 2 Corinthians, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, because he knows that that can be a distraction. Now again, this is a tricky thing to talk about, isn't it? Because people are complicated and relationships are complicated, and sometimes people have found Jesus after they've already been in a relationship, or people in a relationship, if they've changed their opinion, and how you handle that can be really complicated. And again, I'm not trying to pile on guilt or shame onto anyone who finds himself in a situation where they are in a relationship with someone who doesn't follow the ways of Jesus and they're trying to. We want to encourage you and help you in that situation. But I am challenging you to think about, what are the things that distract us? What are the things that cause us to compromise? What are the things that look good but actually pull us away from God? Because we're in very different times. We're not in Jerusalem thousands of years ago. We haven't rebuilt walls. We're not dealing with the king of Babylon and Assyria and Baal and all these different things. But these issues of power, finances, time and relationships are still the key things that can pull us away from God. I spent 4 years studying at Bristol Baptist College, and at the start of the year, every single year, the principal stands up on the very first day and does a talk that is titled Money, Sex and Power. Every single year, the same talk, because he's like, these are the things that time and time and time again will pull you away from God, will destroy your ministry as a leader and can ruin your church. And I would add that whole busyness burnout thing is a massive reason, actually, that ministers end up not being ministers anymore and things go wrong in churches. These issues so easily cause us to compromise. It's interesting, actually, because preparing for this chapter, preparing reading about Nehemiah, actually reminded me of the process that we went on when we were thinking about our vision and values as a church. And I don't know if you remember, but we gathered together sort of last October, and we were really spending time saying, okay, God, who are we? Who are you calling us to be? What is it you want us to focus on? And at that very first meeting, I asked the people that were there, I said, right, I want you to imagine that you've moved away for a good reason. You've not fallen out. You've moved away somewhere. You've gone somewhere else. And then in 10 years' time, you come back. What would you like to find? Well, Nehemiah went away for 12 years and he came back and he didn't like what he found. They'd started off so well, and yet he found that compromise. And when we imagined as a church, let's say we all moved away for a good reason and we came back, what is it we'd want to find in this place? There were ideas and pictures that were given about an open building, working with the community, a community that are really family, that love one another, that were really into discipleship, that were following God, that were committed. And all of that process led us to kind of wheedle it down into 3 things that we are committed to as a church. That we're committed to following God, to loving each other, and to offering hope to all. And my hope is that if for some reason we did all disappear for 10 years and then we came back, obviously someone would need to be left here to keep things going, that whatever form the church takes, whatever the services look like, and that changes over time, doesn't it? That we would find a people who are committed to following God, loving each other and offering hope to all in the way that God is calling them to do it. But that won't just happen by accident. That will happen if we stay focused, if we keep our eyes on what God has given us to do. Our actions now feed into the future of this church and this community. As we've thought about Nehemiah, it's a whole book has been about building, hasn't it? What are you building? How are you building? Who's doing the building? In Nehemiah, we see that every single person had a role to play. They had to stay focused. They faced so much opposition, so much that could distract them, but they had to stay focused. And once they completed that task, that wasn't the time to take the brakes off and rest easy, because that's where the compromise came in. No, they had to stay focused and stay faithful to what God has called them to be. As we think about this church and where God is leading us, I'm really excited. I'm really excited about the potential that we have to make a difference and build his kingdom in this place. And each of us has a role to play. Each of us has a role to play in building the future of this church, building the kingdom of God in this place and the places that God has put us. But we have a decision to make. How are we going to build? What are we going to build on? Where are our foundations? Where do we place our trust? And so we're going to finish our time together now by singing a song together called Build My Life. And it's really a song all about that, about choosing to build our life on what God offers us, on the truth of who he is. and choosing to commit and focus to that. So I'd encourage you to use this song maybe as a time to reflect, or maybe you want to really declare it. Yes, God, I am going to build my life on you and you alone. Thanks.